When a document is translated or otherwise read by technology, an image that can't be displayed might easily change what's communicated by the document unless the image has alternative text. This even happens when a picture fails to load inside a web page due to poor internet connections or missing source files, as evidenced by broken image links. Not understanding what an image is supposed to display because there's no way to see it and there's no alternative text could understandably have a negative impact. As a matter of fact, all content that is not text-based, images, embedded media, complex charts, complex tables, equations, should have alternative text, also known as alt text, so it can be translated into other forms and across technologies, and also better understood. For example, a person relying on a screen reader's assistive technology may not be able to see an image, but the description that is saved as alt text is read to them to convey the meaning of the image. The only exception to this alt text rule is that it is not needed for decorative images. Alt text is also usually not read nor needed for background images. Alt text should be simple and succinct. Anything longer requires a separate written description. An appropriate character length of alt text would be about 140 characters, though different assistive technologies will translate or read different maximum lengths or even none at all. Alt text should convey the meaning of the object. As a rule, images should avoid including text as part of the image, but if that's not possible, the text part of the image should be mentioned in the alt text description. The alt text should not state the obvious. For example, using, quote, an image of, unquote, at the beginning of the alt text on a picture is not necessary. In addition, the alt text should use appropriate language and level of detail for the intended audience. For instance, using scientific terminology in a journal article, but more generic terminology for a publication geared to a more general audience. In this example, poor alt text might be, quote, a picture of a senior citizen shows him on a treadmill, unquote. A better, more descriptive and appropriate alt text would be, quote, a stress test of a senior male on a treadmill is monitored by a healthcare worker reading a cardiogram and another measuring his pulse, unquote. Another visual element in any document is the color selection, and just like you shouldn't depend on a user seeing an image and thus always include alt text, it's important to not use color alone to convey meaning in any document. Differences in color may not be discernible by all users, both those with and without diagnosed vision impairments. For example, a significant percentage of the population cannot distinguish red from green. Alternatives to using color alone might be altering the appearance through shapes, line types, font emphasis, underline, bold, italics, etc. The lines in this sample graph vary by color, line type, and data point marker. In addition, the legend shows the differences so the graph is even more understandable. Additionally, differences in contrast, light to dark, are not always easy to see. Thus, the WCAG guideline success criteria states for most cases that the contrast ratio for objects next to or overlaying each other must be at least 4.5 to 1. This includes any text over background images or text that is part of an image. It also includes the text inside a table that has cells with shading, background colors, and even color-coded maps. There are tools to help find appropriate contrast ratios, but in general, avoid using combinations that are hard for most individuals to read, such as yellow or purple on a green or blue background, red on a black or green background, or light colors on a white background. Continuing with the theme of appearances and making certain your document is accessible to the largest group of people as possible with as little effort as possible, it's important to use typeface, text, and font attributes that translate well across technologies and users. The quality of text in any document is determined by how easily it can be discerned. This includes using standard fonts with characters that are easy to recognize, such as Arial or Times New Roman. Pass over the urge to use a font such as BrushScript or Perpetua. Not only are the standard fonts familiar, which makes it easier to read, but they usually can be resized or zoomed in on without diminished clarity, for example, when using a CCTV. The size of the text using the standard font should not strain anyone's eyes. Try not to use anything less than an 11-point font. In addition, make certain to consider the contrast ratio of the font color to its background color or image. Try to avoid putting text in front of an image, but if you must, be certain it can be easily distinguished. And when the text is actually part of an image, make certain it is clear and retains quality when zoomed or filtered by color. Since there are specific guidelines when it comes to any digital animation, including specific requirements for video and even for more typical wow or attention-grabbing animations, the best practice is simply to avoid animations. For the standard animation, accessibility guidelines dictate that nothing may blink or flash more than 3 times in 1 second. As a best practice, simply avoid flickering text and borders on web pages and in your Word, PowerPoint, and PDF documents. In PowerPoint specifically, avoid any unnecessary animations and side transitions. Bullet points with text that appear one list item at a time is usually fine, as long as there isn't too quick a transition. But an object that bounces into a slide should not be included. Tables are part of the document structure. Tables that are created by following a few simple best practices should translate from one program or technology to another without losing meaning. The first thing is to make sure to always opt to insert a table, for instances in Microsoft Word, or use a table placeholder in PowerPoint. The next thing is to make certain to format tables so that a header row is designated. You should also avoid empty, merged, and split cells unless necessary. There should never be empty cells in a header row, as these cells provide contextual clues as to what is expected in their corresponding columns. Beyond the structure of the table formatting is important so it is visually perceivable by as many people as possible. This would include making sure cell borders or grid lines are always visible. This can be very important to someone navigating a table using a screen magnifier. Additionally, make certain to have sufficient contrast between the color of the text and any background fill colors. And to help make the table more understandable and also provide contextual cues for someone who cannot perceive the table all at once, for instance, someone using a screen reader, make certain to include alt text or a caption for complex tables. If possible, avoid using only images of a chart, graph, or table or any element that is tied to data sets and instead use the true element tied to the data. If you must use an image, make certain to have appropriate alt text and a long description nearby or in a linked resource so a greater segment of the population, beyond those who rely on sight, can perceive the visual representation. In addition, having the display tied to true data makes it easier to project alternate representations and to update the display with future data modifications. One last thing you will want to consider as a best practice in editing any universally accessible document is how hyperlinks are displayed. There's very few times that reading a full URL or web address is helpful. These times are limited to when you need to know the exact internet location of a resource. This would be appropriate, for instance, if you were providing a citation that included a URL address along with the date the source was retrieved. But most times when you read something on a screen or a printout of a document, the true URL doesn't serve as much more than a distraction. And if you are depending on an assistive technology that reads hyperlinks for you, both the displayed text and the linked URL are translated to you, so a URL that is part of the text and linked would actually be read twice in this case. To make a more accessible and stronger document, link only words or phrases that are meaningful within the context of the text. The true URL will be embedded as the hyperlink, but not appear or be read first by the end user. The URL's text should only appear as a hyperlink when it is the purpose of that portion of the text. In addition, the words or phrases that serve as a meaningful hyperlink, or at the very least, the words and phrases in proximity to the linked text, should indicate the purpose of the linked resource. In other words, anyone interacting with a document or page should know, without having to click and navigate to a new web page or other linked resource, where each link will take them. For example, it would be appropriate to link the words Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health to the school's website in an article that discussed the school's engagement with the city, without displaying the actual URL unless the website http www.jhsph.edu was being included as a citation. The thing to keep in mind is that when you are including a hyperlink, if the web address isn't an important part of what is supposed to be read by the end user, or it isn't important to the context, then the web address should only be part of the coded link and not actually displayed.